Okay, good morning everybody. Thanks a lot for coming. I'm very happy to introduce my friend and former colleague, Professor Al Molnar. He's going to give a really interesting talk today on some work that he's doing on imaging in standard silicon CMOS processes. So a little bit about Al before we get started. He received his BS from Swarthmore College back in 1997. After that, he worked at Connexent for about 3 years working on RFIC design. And he was actually one of the architects on an extremely important cell phone chip architecture that ended up resulting in about 100 million users or so of some of the chips that Al worked on, which is really impressive. At that point, he went to UC Berkeley, did his MS on low-power radio design, then switched fields and did his PhD in a neurobiology lab. With that knowledge, he took this off to Cornell, and now he's working on a few things. Started there in 2007, working on low-power software-defined radios, neural interface circuits, and new integrated imaging techniques, which is the subject of his talk today. So let's give Al a hand.
Thanks, Brian. So I have a boring first slide, but it'll make sense as we go along. So I'm actually sort of coming from a circuits background, so we actually think about a number of circuits, as Brian told you. So I'm going to give you a quick overview of my lab, just so you sort of know where we're coming from, and then I'll get into the meat of the talk. So we work on various kinds of things. We work on ultra-flexible software-defined radios. We work on sort of neural circuits, trying to reverse engineer them, and the physical interfaces to them. And we've also been working a lot lately on what we call angle-sensitive pixels, which are a structure we've developed that works, which I'll be talking about today, which work inside, which you can build, I should say, inside of a standard sort of manufacturing flow, but which give you 3D information about what you're imaging. So before I go into the meat of the talk, I'll give you 2 quick trailers, like you're at a movie theater. So my first trailer is on flexible radio receivers. Basically, the idea we've had here that we've been exploring is what happens when you change the architecture of a radio receiver so that the first thing you see is a passive mixer, which has historically been considered to be a very bad idea from various perspectives. But it turns out with a modern process, you can do a lot of interesting things. For one thing, you can actually drive that mixer with a set of pulses rather than with a standard sinusoidal local oscillator. And the result of this is that you actually get all of the properties of your low-frequency circuits in your receiver to actually mirror through onto your RF antenna. And so you can actually basically control all of your RF properties using low-frequency circuits, basically that are under software control. So it gives you sort of unprecedented control over your antenna interface by using purely low-frequency sort of standard analog and mixed signal techniques. So this is sort of the demonstration that that idea works. On the left, you see the ability to sort of control your impedance match on the antenna by just modulating digital numbers. And that this impedance match actually works across more than a decade of frequency. A little bit more surprising is the performance of this kind of radio is extremely good. So out-of-band linearity is extremely high. It's about 2 to 3 orders of magnitude better than anything I ever worked on in industry, which is kind of fun because I spent a lot of time trying to make this good in industry, and then I got to academia and managed to kick my own butt. And then furthermore, the noise of the system is at about where we were in industry, but with all these additional properties. So again, we managed to kick my own butt, and so I'm pretty excited about that. My second trailer will be briefly on some work we've been doing on low noise, low power neural amplifiers. And basically the idea behind this is to try to use power savings techniques that come out of the radio world, which is basically reusing current, bias current, multiple layers, but apply them to baseband low-frequency circuits. And our trick has been to use essentially sort of a fractal structure where we essentially encode our signal in a more and more sort of intermixed way, but in the process save a lot of power. And then basically you can describe this in a matrix format. And if we encode it properly, we end up amplifying about 4 times as many signals as we normally would for the same amount of power and in a sort of orthogonal fashion, so that afterwards, at much lower power, we can reconstruct those signals and end up with essentially about a factor of 3 improvement in power for the same performance. And what's especially interesting about this is because of this orthogonality, the 4 signals we're passing through actually remain relatively independent. They have about a 40 dB isolation between them, even as they're basically reusing exactly the same circuit pathways. So now for the feature presentation, which is imaging with CMOS angle-sensitive pixels. So let me sort of give you a high-level view of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm basically combining 3 different viewpoints. One of those viewpoints is an area known as light field imaging, which is becoming sort of popular lately. This came out of the computer science imaging world about 10, 15 years ago at Stanford, and the first real meaningful product in this space has come out in the last few months, in the Litro camera, which some of you have probably seen press releases on. So the basic idea there is that rather than just capturing an in-focus image with the camera, you actually try to capture information about all the light rays coming in. So that if you have that additional information, as I'll show as we go along, you can reconstruct not just what things look like at one image plane, but actually where all the light's coming from, and therefore a much better 3D reconstruction. The second idea I'll be combining to that is the idea of frequency domain image analysis. And this is actually what your brain does. Your visual cortex, early visual cortex, re-encodes the visual world as a bunch of sort of local wavelets with different orientations and different frequencies. And this is exactly the same technique that gets used in a lot of forms of image compression, like JPEG and so forth. And so we'll be using this, this sort of mathematical viewpoint of images. So for example, here what you see is we have what's sort of the standard, I actually didn't point to it, sort of the standard reference image processing people use. You convolve it with a particular filter that has this impulse response, and you get back, for example, in this case, a representation of only the diagonal edges in the scene. The reason this is considered a good idea is that if you look at most of this reconstruct, or this new image, is the same gray zero color. And so you can compress it a lot because it's a very sparse representation. Most of the results are zero rather than something more complicated. And then finally, we'll try to bring in sort of standard solid-state light field capture, so basic standard semiconductor chips, because of the low-cost benefits there and the ability to manufacture right away. So we don't have to necessarily use any sort of fancy manufacturing. We basically just design it on a computer, send our design off to the fab. They send us chips, and then we try to do 3D imaging with them. So here's a motivation, or an outline of what I'll be talking about. I'll start with some motivation for our 3D work, discuss how you can actually measure angle information, which turns out to be the key, then some ways of using it to do 3D imaging, and then a few other sort of neat things you can do with these same structures. So I'll start with motivation. So our original motivation in this was actually to try to do sort of biomedical, low-cost biomedical things by trying to replace the standard microscope setup, wherein you have a set of sort of fluorescent objects, maybe cells or something like that, under your microscope that you're illuminating, and try to replace that with just a chip. Basically just put a chip under it. And the motivation for that is basically that a typical 3D scope is thousands of dollars, often tens of thousands of dollars, and a chip of this sort in a sort of a standard process is $1. So, you know, at least when I'm selling this to the NIH and NSF, I'm saying here's a factor of 1,000 reduction in your expenses for doing basic assays. And what we learned about this is in order to do this, the key thing is to be able to extract not just the intensity of the light striking your chip, but also the incident angle. Because as you see here, if you have incident angle coming in, then you can basically triangulate back and localize things in space. And so the incident angle information is very key to being able to do anything about stuff that's basically off of your focal point. Once we had this sort of recognition, we realized that this also applies for cases with a lens. So here's the sort of your standard camera imaging setup. You have an object you're imaging. It basically forms an in-focus image on your image sensor, on your CMOS image sensor. And what you see is a clear sort of in-focus image in intensity, and your angle information is sort of homogeneous. There's sort of no information in that. However, if you have an object that's out of focus, either too close or too far, your intensity information degrades. You get a blurring effect, and it degrades both in the sense that you have less resolution, but also in the sense that you can't actually tell whether you're near or far. You can't distinguish these two cases. However, if you have incident angle information, now you can. You can see, in this case, whoops, go back one. In this case, clearly you are closer than the focal plane. In this case, you're farther away. And furthermore, if you know enough about the angle information, you can actually reconstruct back to that other focal plane. So you can bring back your 3D information by having this additional captured information. So this leads to a sort of a general statement of the problem with light field capture. So the light field is this idea of characterizing the light coming in not just by intensity, but also by the incident angle and location. So for in focus, we have sort of a 2D XY spatial information we want to capture. If we're out of focus, we're more interested now in the sort of theta phi angle information. And overall, what we want to capture is what's been described as the planopic function, which is in this case a four-dimensional problem of location xy and angle theta phi. So that's the problem we want to solve. We want to build a system that's low cost and small, but captures this kind of information. Okay, so the next question is, how do we capture this? So we're going to base this on some work that was originally done by Henry Fox Talbot in the 1800s. Talbot is actually one of the inventors of the camera. He's one of a couple people who did the early work on film cameras. But he also observed this phenomenon called the Talbot effect, which is a pretty basic physical phenomenon, which is that if you shine a plane wave onto a diffraction grating, at certain depths below that diffraction grating, you get essentially a strong interference pattern that has the same pitch as the original diffraction grating. And it happens at these known depths set by the Talbot depth given at the bottom here. So how can we use that? Well, if we have light coming down, we get this Talbot effect. And if we were to sample that light intensity at one of those Talbot depths, we get this clear, sort of strong periodic interference pattern. If the incident angle of light coming in changes, then that interference pattern shifts. So now we can rephrase our problem as trying to detect shifts in this interference pattern. If we can do that, then we can go back to angle. And how can we detect that? Well, one very simple way to do this is just to add another diffraction grating. And now, in some cases, when the light's aligned one way, the peaks of that diffraction pattern hit the second grating and are blocked. In other cases, they hit the gaps and pass through. And so now what happens is you sweep incident angle in simulation and in reality is that you get this strongly periodic response being at the detector as a function of incident angle. So I can basically translate incident angle into this strongly periodic intensity response. So I get a periodic output. Now, the reason that particular structure is nice is it's very, very easy to build in a standard CMOS stack. So basically, we already have a whole bunch of metal layers for our wiring, so we just reuse those layers as our diffraction patterns, diffraction gratings, I should say. So for example, in this particular design, we use M6 for one of them, M3 for the other, and then we still have our full back end, or sort of, I should say, front end, really, CMOS structures below. So we have amplifiers and photodiodes and all the other sort of trappings of a normal CMOS or CMOS imager process. So we can build this, and we can build this in a standard process so that the people who are actually manufacturing it have no idea that we're doing this. This is the same exact process that you'd build a microprocessor in or a radio or anything else. And as far as the factory is concerned, they don't know. You send them a design, they send you back chips. Okay, now there's a problem with this, which is this single pixel is just not enough information. And to see why that's true, imagine I measured this level of intensity for a pixel with this particular response. In this case, there's several interpretations for this result. One is that I'm at one of these two locations with this angle and this intensity. But another is that I'm actually at this location with less intensity and a different angle. So I can't actually tell, I can't disambiguate angle versus intensity in this case. However, I had a complementary response that was just basically sort of its mirror image. Now I could, because no matter what the intensity of the overall light is, in these cases here, I should point, I guess, the two are equal. In this case, they're very different, and I can begin to sort of disambiguate those two problems. In order to extract that function, I basically just take my existing structure where the two gratings are aligned and shift the second grating over by half a period. And that gives me exactly this alternate response. And in fact, I can go further than that. I can give what's essentially a full quadrature response, where I have both the sine and the cosine terms here, by just shifting them, giving two more that shift by a quarter period. I can model this as a set of sinusoidal responses. And what you can see here is there are several terms that are matters. There's the basic intensity response. There's sort of a generalized aperture term, which typically reflects the sort of reflection off the surface of the chip and anything sort of outside of that. We have a modulation term, M, which basically defines how deep those valleys are relative to the peaks. And finally, we have this term beta, which is essentially an angular gain term, which translates the actual incident angle into the sort of effective phase of one of these sine waves. And so that number is typically on the order of 10 or higher. With this information, I can still extract my intensity information by just basically taking the averages of complementary responses. But I can also now actually compute incident angle directly by just doing a trigonometric transform on it. So from a sort of a circuitry perspective, what we can say here is that the intensity information is captured in the common mode of these signals, and the angular information is captured in the differential mode by subtracting things. Okay, so we've built these. This was the first set of angle-sensitive pixels we built. You can see here we have our 4 different phases. Here's the actual measured response from that. You can also notice that here we actually have both vertical and horizontal because we need to get both vertical and horizontal angle. We need both azimuth and elevation in order to actually get meaningful sort of solid angle information. Okay, so we can build them and they work. Now, what can we do with them? So first of all, we'll look at what we can do without a lens. So the first thing we did was just built a small array of these. So it's an 8x8 array of these structures. And if you suspend a light source above this chip, about, in this case, about half a millimeter above this chip, you get a set of responses that look like this. And what you can see is each of these little squares is a single photodiode with its own grating, and each of these blocks of 8 is one of those tiles that's identical. And what you can sort of see is that within those blocks of 8, you get a very sort of heterogeneous response, because each of them is responding to a different angle space. But sort of across them, they're much more correlated because we have a strongly blurred signal. Now, from those blocks of 8, we can compute angle. We just showed that. So we can compute a vector field and back out where that light came from. And this works in 3 dimensions. So we can back it out both in the XY plane, but also in the Z plane. And it tracks that light source quite accurately. In fact, when you do the math out on this, it tracks it to an accuracy of something on the order of a micron or less, even when you're half a millimeter away. So that's pretty cool. Of course, this isn't really imaging, because imaging isn't just one light source. It's a multiplicity of them. And so then now you run into this problem is, if I'm just thinking of this in terms of incident angle, then as soon as I have two light sources, I have areas where the incident angle is just not defined. So how can I deal with this fact that my sort of basic idea is kind of not right? Well, I can observe that at these various locations, if I'm getting a strong response from an angle-sensitive pixel with this sort of curve, and I'm getting a strong response, and that means I'm probably getting light from one of these regions, one of these sort of lobes. So if I sort of back project those responses, I can back project into space where the light's likely to have been coming from. I can sort of do a sort of reverse correlation on that and say, for example, if these angle-sensitive pixels with these responses are having a strong response, then I'm probably having light sources from sort of these two general regions. Now, one thing to notice is that we don't really use the single angle-sensitive pixels. We use these differences. So from here on out, I'm going to be working on these pairs of angle-sensitive pixels where I subtract them and get these essentially sine and cosine terms out of them. And if you just sort of take this idea of back projection, you can actually compute the resolution of the system like this. And you see that the resolution basically depends on how far away you are, which isn't surprising. As you get farther away, everything gets blurred out more. But it also depends on this term beta, this angular gain term. So if you have a higher angular gain, you get sort of a narrower range of field for each of your directions, and therefore a higher resolution. And this works both in the xy direction, but also in the z direction, because now this additional term here is just basically saying how far from the left and right can we project to sort of nail down that third dimension. So you can apply this to actual real systems. So this is a clump of fluorescent beads hung about 1 millimeter above one of our chips. If we have one clump here, you see we have a clear sort of blob here that's being found in this artifact. And that artifact is just a function of the fact that we are actually operating on a periodic response. If I put two of those things in there, well, now things get a lot worse. And this is sort of a symptom of the angle ambiguity thing. And you can see that now I'm starting to have trouble resolving those two sources. So one solution is to say, well, if my resolution depends on that angular gain term, why don't I just increase my angular gain, as I've done here? So now I've got a higher frequency response, essentially, a higher beta, and I get, therefore, a higher resolution. But you can already see the problem with that. The problem is now I also have a lot more ambiguity points. There are lots of possible options that would explain that. And sure enough, if you apply this to the actual data, you see exactly that. For 1 and 2 clumps, you have just this absolute zoo of possible options. So it's not really working that well. So what can we do? Well, the key, it turns out, is to have a diverse set of angle-sensitive pixels. And basically, the thinking there is that, on the one hand, the high beta ones give you good resolution, whereas the low beta ones give you good ambiguity. And so if you actually combine them, then, and essentially overlap the responses, now you get the high resolution, but you eliminate all those ambiguity points. So does that work? So these are our two individual sets. If we actually combine both sets of those angle-sensitive pixels, basically what we're combining them by just interleaving them in a mosaic. Now we get a much better result, where basically we get the high resolution of the high beta ones, but the reduced ambiguity of the low beta ones, and we get a very clear sort of, there are two light sources in there, and in fact there are two, and they're the right places. Okay, so the sort of lesson we got out of this was it's important to not just have this angle-sensitive response, but actually have a diverse set of them, enough variety that we can sort of eliminate ambiguity and solve our problems. And there's a sort of a formalism to that I'll get to. So how can we sort of formalize this problem? Well, one way of looking at this is just to try to put it into a linear systems viewpoint. So one way you can say this is say basically each location in space can be emitting light or not. It's got some amount of light emission associated with it. So we'll call that set of possible sources X. It's a vector. And we have a sensor array of things that can detect light with a particular sort of response pattern. We'll call that Y. And we can basically, you can derive a linear transform that transforms X to Y through just a matrix A. Okay, so that's nice. So then we just want the inverse. If we can invert that, we can take our responses from our individual pixels and reconstruct the visual world. Except the problem is that our sensor array is a planar system. It's a planar system of complicated pixels, but it's still a planar system. So it's got a dimension of n squared. And our volume it's a volume. It's a sort of a cube, n cubed. So this A is never going to be square. So it's not going to be invertible. So we're a little bit stuck. It doesn't matter that we've made great pixels. We still don't have an invertible problem. We can't really formally do 3D reconstruction. And this actually, it turns out to apply to just about every 3D imaging system you've seen. You have this problem with your two eyes. You basically have two pieces of information about each thing from which you compute 3D. But you're not doing real 3D. You're doing something simpler than that. Holograms have the same problem. This is actually a pretty general problem for most forms of passive 3D. So what can we do? Well, one thing we can do in the context of our sort of little floating blobs in space is just assume that we have a sparse set of floating blobs in space and add that as a constraint. And it turns out this is a nice constraint to use because it fits very well with the whole branch of signal processing that's been developing in the last decade in compressive sensing. And so basically what we can do is, rather than just trying to minimize the mean square error, which is essentially what you do when you do an inversion, we try to minimize the mean square error with an additional penalty associated with being non-sparse. And when you apply that mathematics, you get a much, much better result. And in fact, we've shown in various simulations and stuff, you can reconstruct 10 or more light sources in space with very high accuracy. So this is basically just based on using techniques out of the sort of compressed sensing basis pursuit in space. So that's one way of attacking it. The other way to attack it is to notice that in real sort of camera-style imaging, we're not actually really solving a 3D problem, because really you can't see everything in 3D. What you typically see is an opaque surface at various depths. So if you're looking at a tree, you don't really see the whole tree, you just see the surface of the tree. You don't have to code all that stuff behind that because it's not visible. So another way of saying this is what we really want to be able to do is map depth, which is essentially a 2D problem, and then accurately construct the surface that we're mapping the depth of. So do some sort of computational refocus to bring all of those things into a high acuity image. So it's really two 2D problems, a depth mapping problem and a computational refocus problem, rather than some general purpose 3D problem. And now this is it's a more invertible problem. Okay, so now a key piece to doing, sort of setting up that math and making this work is to notice that in these systems, angle and space map to each other. So for example, if I have an object at this location, and I'm out of focus, so it's brought into focus here, at this angle-sensitive pixel, that original offset in space maps to an angle offset at the pixel. And for different objects, we just basically get different angles. So any given pixel sitting in an out-of-focus image will be essentially mapping locations in space to locations in angle at that location over some range. So we can sort of formalize that math out, and just it's basically this is a convolution integral. But basically what you want to see is in here we have the angular response of our pixels, and it's basically responding to x, the location of the image, and z, the offset of the image in the third dimension. So both of those things are contained in that response. And what that means now is that basically, our response is basically combining the blue light coming here at this point on its angular response and the red light coming at this angular response. And basically it's just convolving the spatial locations by its angular transfer function modified by depth. Okay, so to actually do this, of course, we need a chip. So we designed a large, for us, array of these pixels. So this is about a 300 kilopixel sensor. It has various circuitry and stuff on it as well. That's one of the nice things about being in CMOS is you can incorporate not just your optics, but also all of your electronics. And it's all essentially 100% reliable, provided you design it right. So we've got a set of pixels, but we've also got various samples and holes, amplifiers, and so forth. Now, one lesson we took from our previous work was that diversity was important. So we actually went a little bit crazy on that. And so we actually have 4 different angular gains, 12, 8, 16, and 24, basically designed by changing the interlayer separation and the pitch of those gratings to get various different optical properties. We also, as you can see, have 4 different orientations. We have vertical and horizontal, but now we've added some diagonals. And finally, we have our 4 phases, essentially our sine and cosine terms being reconstructed. So we end up with a total of 64 pixels inside of this single block. But one thing I want to point out is the first response people typically have is, wow, your resolution is terrible because you just made this gigantic pixel. But when you're in focus, the in-focus light hits these individual sensors individually. So when you're in focus, your resolution is still down at the individual pixel scale. It's still at the scale of one of these little blocks. But as you go out of focus and things blur out, now you start picking up angular information and you sort of can hold on to your focus for longer. So it doesn't really cost us in-focus resolution. It just adds when you're out of focus. Okay, so we just confirmed these things work. They do. They're not quite as pretty as our original designs because our modeling was a little bit off, but they're pretty enough, as we'll see, to do all of our fun stuff. One other neat little trick we realized is we're doing all this stuff with metal. Of course, all that metal is really supposed to be wires. That's what they put it in there for. So what we can actually do is for each of our sensors, we have a little local buffering, and it's a standard in a CMOS imager. And then we route back out on our own diffraction gratings. So we can actually use the diffraction gratings as buses as well to bring the information out. So we actually get a sort of a benefit in parallelism of being able to route a lot of our stuff out quickly. Okay, so does this work? So our first problem was rangefinding. So we'll start with a really simple problem. We're going to have 3 white bars for the really wires at 3 different depths. And we're going to image them with our image sensor through a lens at a distance of about 1 meter. And if we just look at the intensity image we take, this is what we see. And what you can sort of see here is, Sure enough, the middle one looks a little bit more in focus than these two ones. You could probably tell by sort of squinting at it that probably this one's in focus and these two aren't. But that's probably about as far as you could go. However, you take the output of one of those angle-sensitive pixels and image it, one of the differences of them, I should say, you get something like this. And now what's important to note here is as we sort of slice through the responses, here are 3 bars of intensity. Over here on the angle-sensitive side, we get 3 very different responses. On the first one, we have sort of positive and then negative. On the second one, we basically have no angle response at all. And on the third one, we have negative and then positive. So clearly, there's a lot more information hiding in here about something. So how do we interpret that? Well, we remember this is what we're actually getting our original angle information from, is a curve like this. This is one of our angle-sensitive responses. And because we have a lens in front of this with a finite aperture, we're actually really only looking at this region of the response. The rest of it is outside of the aperture range. So now I can interpret this. I can say if I see a positive response, then I must be on that region of the angle-sensitive of the angle, and so light must be coming from there. If I get a negative response, then I'm on the other side, and light must be coming from there. And if I'm getting no angle response, but I've got a clear intensity signal, then that must mean things are canceling out, and I must have my 2 sort of directions overlapping with each other. So I can back out sort of conceptually, and there's math to back this up. I can back out essentially a local map of rays. Now I can interpret that from a range mapping perspective as follows. I can say, well, if I have an object that's closer than my focal plane, then I'll have converging rays, which means that this bar here is actually closer than the focal plane. If I have diverging rays, then it means I'm farther away than the focal plane, so that means that this bar here is actually farther away. And if I have essentially no response, then I'm in focus. And so I can just construct, based on that math, I can reconstruct a range map of the system, which as you can see here, where clearly the blue one is the far one away. There's a sort of an inversion to the lens. And the green one is the closer one, and this one is sort of a little bit of signal there, but it's weaker. And this works not just for simple bars, but for more complex scenes as well. So for example, here we have several dice. You can see they're all a little bit blurry, so you know they're out of focus, but how are they out of focus? Well, with our additional angle information, we can compute a range map, and you can see, in fact, that the front dice are, in fact, nearer than the focal plane. The back dice are behind it. And actually, if you look at the actual numbers in here, it's a little bit harder to display. These sort of objects in the back are even further behind. So it's actually working out where things are in depth based on this angle information. So that's half the problem. Half the problem was depth mapping. It does that. The second half is computational refocus. And so the problem here, what we're going to do is basically present ourselves with 2 words that we can see at the same distance, but now we're going to deliberately defocus it badly. So we give ourselves a hard problem. So here's what the pure intensity image looks like. You can see it's pretty badly blurred. You probably, if you didn't see the stuff on the right, you probably wouldn't be able to read those words very well. Okay, now what happens when I look at the angle responses? If I take those differences of sinusoids I get, this is the responsive one. You can see right away there's sort of more information there. There's sort of additional, in this case, horizontal information coming through in the angle information for the defocused image. And remember, we actually have 64 pixels, so 32 differences. So if we look at all 32 of them, there we have essentially 32 distinct pictures. And you can sort of see all the various properties of those pixels hiding in here. So for example, here we have a relatively high frequency vertical one. Here we have a lower frequency vertical one. You can see they have sort of different periods. Here we have a diagonal one. Here we have a horizontal one. Here and here we basically have the sine and the cosine versions of things. So we have all these different sort of properties coming through essentially as images. So then the question is, if we have all this additional information, how can I use this to reconstruct my scene? Well, one thing to notice is that we've been modeling these essentially as sines and cosines. And and each of our responses basically has its own frequency, its own phase, and its own orientation. And this is very, very similar to essentially a local 2D Fourier transform, a very low order 2D Fourier transform. It's probably sort of second or third order. And these are actual measured impulse responses. So if each of these is extracting a sort of local Fourier transform, we're basically getting this transform computed in the optical domain and being spat out to us. Now, how can I use that information to get back? Well, the thing to remember is that the Fourier transform is its own inverse. So I can basically take these sort of sub-images, convolve them with their own impulse responses. And if I add that up, I actually get back a better estimate of what I'm looking at. So for example, here I'm doing it for the lower order one for the beta of 12s. I can do the same thing for the beta of 24. And now I can take all my various terms and add them up, and I get a much, much clearer image. So I can basically take an incomprehensible image and pop it back into focus. And one thing I should point out is there's some artifacts in this reconstruction, and we didn't really understand our math until after we built this thing. The artifacts are essentially the result of this not being a perfect Fourier transform. We don't quite tile frequency space properly, and so we get a little bit of artifacting as a result. But it still works pretty well. And indeed, this works not only on sort of simple words, but on more complex scenes. So here we'll use the dice again. First thing we do is range mapping. In this case, we find, wow, everything is out of focus far. So when I computationally refocus, I want to head in that direction. And then I basically just sort of crank my refocus back by changing the scale of my impulse responses that I'm convolving with. I can bring, for example, the front dice into focus. And now you can see that you can actually, whoops, let me go back. You can actually see now the individual dots on the bottom here that were previously invisible, and the back dice comes into focus. You can even focus beyond that to the back one. And at some point, you begin to lose resolution. This is not a perfect technique. There are limits on everything. But you can get a much more sort of computationally focused out of this approach. So that's the basic idea for the 3D imaging. What else can we do with this? So one thing to realize in all of this is that what we're really doing is a form of filtering. So if we just take a blurred image, blurring an image optically is equivalent to doing a low-pass filtering on it. It's basically just sort of removing your high-frequency components and getting a low-pass response, which means that our angle-sensitive pixels are essentially doing a bandpass response. They're capturing a range of frequencies around their sort of period. And so what we're really doing is building a bank of bandpass filters in 2D space based on our individual pixels. So what can we do with that? Well, first of all, let's just check that idea. So remember from before, from this sort of ray diagram, that if we have a bandpass filter in space, in an angle, then that maps back to a bandpass filter in space. So everything that we're talking about in the angle domain maps to a spatial transform. Now, how can we sort of test this idea? Well, one thing we can do is we talk to our image processing friends, and they suggested that we use this sort of ray pattern they use often, which, here we go. I've lost my, there we go. This ray pattern here, which has the nice property of very clearly having all those different orientations and frequencies built right into it. So you can very clearly see here in the center, I've lost myself. In the center, you have high frequency stuff. At the edges, you have low frequency stuff. It's sort of, your frequency domain is spread out in space, so it's easy to find. So if we show our imager this out of focus, what do we get? Again, looking at all those 32 responses, now you can clearly see that for the lower frequency ones, we get stuff near the edge. For the higher frequency ones, we get stuff near the middle. All those different phases and orientations are present. And basically, we are indeed doing bandpass filtering. We are picking out particular bands of in both angle or I should say orientation and in frequency. So what is this good for? Well, remember at the beginning I was talking about frequency domain analysis, and one of the things it's good for is image compression. So for example, if I take this classic image, I convolve it with a set of essentially sort of low-order wavelet bandpass filters that are wavelets. I get responses like this. So for example, this one extracts all the diagonal high-frequency terms. This one extracts lower-frequency vertical terms, and so forth. And the reason this is valuable is that if you look at the original image and look at its histogram, you have this signal that's sort of spread across all the possible values. So it's very hard to compress. But once I've done this transform, then most of those outputs are near zero, as you can sort of see in the common gray here. And so if I round this off, most of my things will round to zero. And so I can essentially make my image much, much more sparse without really necessarily losing very much information. And then by making it zero, it's very easy to code zeros with a sort of a high, rather with relatively few bits. And so I can get a much more compact image out of this. And the main key to being able to build something that you can reconstruct is that you have to fill in frequency space. You have to be sure that when you look at your various bandpass filters you're using, they fill in the 2D frequency space. So for example, here, this one here is this band in frequency here. This one here is this band here, and so on. Okay, well, we've basically shown that we can do this in hardware. So remember, again, we're doing our space-to-angle transformation. And this is the next generation chip we developed. And you can see there's a whole variety of different gradings here. This is actually a picture of one of our tiles. And in here, we have, for example, looking at their impulse responses. So it's just basically showing a single point of light and seeing what we get out. We have a set of low-frequency ones of various orientations that fill out this region of frequency space. We have a set of high-frequency ones that fill out this region of frequency space. And we have a set of intermediate ones that are basically designed to sort of fit into the gaps. So we can fill out a reasonable space of frequency. Now, using those, we then show it this image. And we get this whole family of, in this case, 24 distinct images. And you can see, again, they're fairly sparse. The majority of the pixels in each of these cases are near gray. And I can actually round these off now, so I do. So I start with an 8-bit, 1.2 megabit, I should say, image. And now these are more like 5-bit encoding because I can actually round off without losing much information. And if I try to reconstruct back, basically all the edge information comes back through. So you can see basically all the edges have been extracted, but a dramatic compression in the amount of data we have to use to encode it. Furthermore, we still have our original blurred image. We capture the intensity information as well. But because it's blurred, we can undersample it. We downsample that by a significant factor. And then when we reconstruct, we can still reconstruct essentially the same image, but with about a 10-to-1 reduction in the amount of bits we need to encode it. Now, a 10-to-1 in compression ratio is not a great compression ratio, but there was no computation in this. All of the convolutions were all done optically for 0 power. And then the rounding you do in your own analog-to-digital converter on board. So you actually make a lower power analog-to-digital converter because it's doing fewer bits. And so you can actually do all these operations for reduced power on your imager. So although the compression is not as good, the power consumption is mind-numbingly better. And we haven't even talked about the 3D aspect of this. So you're kind of getting everything in there. OK, so what else can we do this? Well, the last thing we did with this general idea space was to recognize that there's sort of an extreme here we could go to. If one extreme is the standard imager with a bunch of intensity-sensitive pixels and no angle information, and we're operating sort of in a mixed angle space thing, well, why not just go all the way to angle? So to do that, we basically said, well, what's the highest beta device we can build in our process? And it's about 50, it turns out, for this particular manufacturing. So we're basically just going to build sort of all the possible sort of fill-in frequency space below that beta. And it turns out we can do sort of every harmonic of a beta of 4, we'll call it, which comes out to about 4,000 sensors. So we built that. Here's the actual chip. Oops. It's got about half a millimeter by a millimeter. It's got basically all those different orientations and frequencies built into it. And the nice thing about this, these are essentially, again, impulse responses of a sort. The nice thing about this is that all these things are orthogonal to each other if we do it right. Or we at least can find an orthogonal set in there. So it's relatively easy to invert. And now what we have is a tiny little camera, you can hear it as well for the penny. This is the requisite Pennyshot. All micro scale people have to do. It takes things essentially in the Fourier domain, and then we can invert it back. So for example, if I take a picture of an edge, I can invert back and get an edge. If I picture a spot, I can invert back and get a spot. If I take a picture of the Mona Lisa, I get something that's definitely not fine art, but most people look at that and do recognize a face there. So it's a bad camera, but it's really, really small. And so what we've been thinking about this is sort of fills in the space between the low end of cameras and the single photodiode. Like there's a space there of low resolution imaging that no one really uses because once you get to having a lens and stuff, you may as well have a camera. So we're sort of now looking at what can you do with sort of 40 pixel or 400 pixel resolution cameras for really simple control applications and so forth. So in summary, what I've talked about today is a CMOS pixels that are sensitive to incident angle as well as intensity, with these sort of periodic responses. We've been able to build arrays that are able to capture 3D information, both in the lensless case, but also with lenses to get depth information and computational refocus. And we've shown that we can also use this information format in an efficient way because it gives us things in essentially a compressed format or even in a completely lensless image capture format. So overall, it's sort of a whole new set of digital imaging capabilities in standard CMOS. So very low cost, but a whole new space of kind of classes of information you can capture. With that, I want to acknowledge the various people involved. Albert Wong, who's about to graduate. I lost him. He's in the middle somewhere. He did the initial work on this. Patrick Gill, my postdoc, who did a lot of the signal processing. Sri Ram's working on newer ones, and then I have several other people working on radios, amplifiers, and so forth. And I've gotten support from the NIH, DARPA, NSF. Moses gave us a free run, and Cornell startup helped fund it all. Thanks.
OK, thanks a lot, Al. Do we have some questions, Josh?
So you said the power consumption is low when you use this technique. Can you say how much energy it takes to capture an image, or how much you think it could take if you did reasonable?
Sure. So for the one I was showing the compression for, that thing works at, I think it's 30 frames per second, consuming about a milliwatt, spitting out a digitized, compressed image. And it could probably be lower power than that. We were being kind of conservative. It's a bit more. It's probably 1.5 milliwatts now, but that can probably be taken down a bit more.
So what's the limitation on the lensless version? If you take a lot more silicon, how much silicon do you need to get a good image resolution?
That's a really good question, and we've been looking at that. The limitation turns out not to be silicon area. I mean, we could fill in more area, but the primary limitation is getting a reliable response. And basically, the way you get a higher frequency response, so your resolution is basically set by sort of reversing classical sampling theory. Your resolution is set by your highest frequency capture. And the way you get higher frequency is by either making the gratings finer, but at some point you hit wavelength and you can't go finer. So you can't go below about 2 lambda and it starts not working. Or making them farther up. So just basically separating them by more. But as you separate them by more, the problem now is you become more and more sensitive to slight changes in either separation or the depths of the Talbot effect. And the Talbot effect is wavelength sensitive. So everything I showed here was for white light, but at some point that sensitivity gets so strong that you just start blurring everything out. And so if you have color filters in play, you can get probably a bit more. But there's there's this trade-off. Is basically as you go to higher resolution, you become less and less reliable. And so one thing we actually did in this original design is we sort of did an over-complete set. We didn't do just a simple, precise Fourier transform set, but actually more than that to sort of cover ourselves. And then basically went back and found the ones that were good and used those. There's an easy way to find the good ones and sort of pull them out. So you can get some coverage that way, but there is sort of a fundamental limit there. So I think we can probably do 2 to 3 times better than we have so far, and then beyond that we need to either rethink our manufacturing or there's some other, some additional innovation needed.
So to get a reliable image out of what you're just talking about, do you have a range limitation typically? Or?
For the depth mapping aspect of it? Yeah, so there's as you move farther away, essentially, I can point at a diagram, makes a little more sense. Let's pick this one here. In this general image, so what we're actually sensing when we do depth mapping is actually this depth here between the image and the plane. But there's essentially a gain term between this depth here and this depth here, and it's not linear. So as you move farther away, that gain gets worse. So there is limit. So we did all this work at about a meter distance with a standard camera lens, and it worked pretty well. It has sort of millimeter-ish resolution if you process it over a region. But if you put this on a telephoto lens and try to image, get millimeter resolution at something that was a kilometer away, there's no way it wouldn't work at all. So we're still sort of quantifying all the limitations on it, but there are, as you move farther away, your depth resolution gets worse. And probably not linearly, it's probably worse than that.
Any other questions? So when you had each of these pixels that had multiple detectors in it with different angles and different spatial resolutions, how do you decide how to place those within each tile?
That's a really good question, and actually up to now, so everything I showed, we pretty much we've tried to get ones with the same sort of complementary ones and the sines and cosine ones near each other, so they'd be really computing on the same angle. And beyond that, we just sort of stuck them in there. Okay. In fact, what we did, we originally had, you saw I had 2 designs I showed, and one of them was very structured, was divided up by frequency and so forth. And then we actually understood what we were doing a little bit better and did some math and found that pretty reliably, if we did them randomly, it was better. Like, I don't know what the optimum is, but everything structured we ever came up with was worse than the random. So we ended up with just a random collection, which seems really stupid, but I think there's some defense for that. But actually, since then, we've been thinking a lot about what the real optimal is. What we think is true is that if you're in a system where you're actually likely to pass through the focal plane, you probably don't want the same numbers of each type. So what we have some math now we've just sort of done the last month that seems to indicate that what you really want to do is you want more of the low frequency ones than the high frequency ones. And so you have a sort of an inhomogeneous distribution of them. That way, when you're close to in focus, you still get a full set of the low frequency ones. The high frequency ones just sort of blur out and don't matter. But you still have the full set of the low frequency ones. And then as you blur out, they become redundant, but you pull in the high frequency ones and you still maintain resolution. So probably we don't really know the full answer yet, but it's something like that. There's some sort of inhomogeneity, sort of balancing of angle and space there.
Cool, okay. We have time for one or 2 more questions before we let Al go.
I want to answer the question that no one's asked yet, which is, doesn't that metal lose you a lot of light? Hope somebody thought of that. We just stacked 2 layers of metal on top of our pixels. That's got to kill us. It does. It's awful. It costs about a factor of 10. But I have a backup slide, which is why I brought it up. We just showed that you can build alternate structures that use what are called phase gratings, using a little bit of tricks out of MEMS, where you can basically remove the top grating and replace it with a crenellated sort of oxide surface. And then all that light's kept, but you get the same effect. And you can build an alternate set of detectors using sort of finer grained photodiodes and remove the second grating. So we actually have a forward device path as well, where we can sort of eliminate our light loss problems, but still keep all the functionality. That's my little plug. Okay. I was hoping someone was going to ask it, and I could respond.
Josh.
So, as you probably know, the Connect is really popular, especially with roboticists right now, because that depth information is incredibly useful. Would you see any reason this couldn't be used to do the exact same thing?
I think this would be great for that. I'm talking to robotics people right now because of that. There's a little bit of a trade-off because active systems tend to do a little bit better at more distant objects, but this is the big benefit of being passive. There's no radiation, so it works better under bright, sort of varying illumination, and we can sort of just crank the gain up and down. So I mean, I actually, when I talk to some of my friends in that space, I kind of say, if you wanted the best of all worlds, what you'd probably do is have both. When you're sort of in a dark space where you really care about, you can turn on your active illumination and get that. But sort of when you don't care quite as much, you can cut your power way down and be much more robust by just running in a passive mode. So yeah, I absolutely see that as an application for this.
All right, if there's no other questions, well, let's thank Al for a great talk. Thanks.